Millionaire CEO who was single for 30 years, falls in love at first sight with a humble black waitress. His perfectly manicured fingers had signed billion-dollar deals, but they trembled when she placed that glass of wine on his table and smiled. A smile that shattered 30 years of carefully constructed walls in a single, breathtaking moment. Harrison Reed, worth $2.3 billion, was about to risk everything for a woman who had no idea she was talking to New York's most ruthless CEO. But when she collapsed during her shift 3 weeks later, gasping his name as paramedics rushed her to the hospital, Harrison faced a choice that would either save her life or destroy the only real love he'd ever known. Because the truth he'd been hiding wasn't just about money, it was about to break the heart of the only woman who'd ever seen him as human. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The 62nd floor of Manhattan's gleaming Meridian Tower buzzed with a kind of controlled chaos that only money could orchestrate. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled like a conquered kingdom, and at the center of it all sat Harrison Reed, 38 years old, worth $2.3 billion, and lonelier than he'd ever admit to the fortune-hungry socialites who circled him like well-dressed vultures. Harrison's steel-gray eyes reflected nothing as he reviewed the quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk. Each number represented someone's dream, someone's livelihood, someone's future. But to him, they were just digits in an endless equation of profit and loss. His Armani suit hung perfectly on his athletic frame, tailored to disguise the weight he carried that had nothing to do with fabric or flesh. "Mr. Reed." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your lunch reservation at Le Bernardin is confirmed for 1 o'clock. Harrison glanced at his Patek Philippe watch, 12:47 p.m. Another business lunch with another potential acquisition target. Another performance where he'd smile at the right moments, laugh at mediocre jokes, and close deals that would add more zeros to his already incomprehensible net worth. But as he stood to leave, straightening his charcoal tie, Harrison caught his reflection in the darkened window. For just a moment, he saw past the confident CEO facade to something raw and hollow beneath. When was the last time someone had looked at him, really looked at him, and seen Harrison Reed the man instead of Harrison Reed the bank account? What do you think drives a successful person to feel so empty inside? Share your thoughts below. Meanwhile, 23 floors below and 3 miles across town, Naomi Williams tied her apron strings with hands that never stopped moving. The lunch rush at Savoy's was about to begin, and she'd learned that staying busy meant staying employed, something she couldn't afford to lose. At 26, Naomi possessed the kind of natural beauty that made heads turn on subway platforms and photographers stop her on street corners with business cards she never called. Her warm brown skin seemed to glow even under the harsh restaurant lighting, and her hair was pulled back in a neat bun that showcased the elegant curve of her neck. But it was her eyes, deep, intelligent, and full of dreams she kept carefully hidden, that truly set her apart. "Naomi, honey, you've got table 12. Called Margaret, the floor manager, as she rushed past with an armload of menus. High-roller businessman. Probably won't even look up from his phone, but keep that smile bright anyway." Naomi nodded, smoothing her black vest and checking her reflection in the polished surface of the coffee machine. She'd been working at Savoy's for 8 months now, and she'd learned to read the clientele like a survival manual. The Wall Street types barely acknowledged her existence, treating servers like sophisticated vending machines. The tourists tipped well but asked too many questions she didn't have time to answer. The lonely hearts lingered over coffee, hungry for conversation she couldn't always provide. But every shift, every smile, every "how are you enjoying your meal today?" brought her closer to her real dream, the one she whispered to herself in the mirror of her tiny Brooklyn studio apartment. Naomi Williams was going to be a teacher. She'd saved nearly enough for her education degree, penny by careful penny, tip by modest tip. In 2 years, maybe 3, she'd trade her serving tray for a classroom where she could shape young minds instead of arranging silverware. The kitchen doors swung open with their familiar whoosh, and Naomi gathered herself for another performance. She'd perfected the art of being invisible while indispensable, friendly but not familiar, competent but not threatening. It was a delicate balance that kept the peace and kept her employed. Table 12, Harrison Reed, she murmured to herself, checking the reservation list. The name meant nothing to her, just another suit with money to spend and places to be. Harrison arrived at Savoy's with 5 minutes to spare, his black town car pulling up to the understated entrance of what many considered the finest restaurant in Lower Manhattan. The maitre d' recognized him immediately. Money had a way of making faces memorable. "Mr. Reed, welcome back. Your usual table." Harrison nodded, following the familiar path through the dining room. Savoy's was his preferred venue for delicate negotiations, intimate enough for private conversation, impressive enough to remind potential partners of his status. The soft classical music, cream-colored walls, and discreetly placed orchids created an atmosphere where million-dollar handshakes felt as natural as breathing. He was reviewing his notes on the pharmaceutical company he planned to acquire when she appeared at his table like a vision he didn't know he'd been waiting for. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reed. I'm Naomi, and I'll be taking care of you today." Harrison looked up from his leather portfolio, and the world shifted on its axis. She stood beside his table with perfect posture, professional but warm, holding a small notepad and wearing a smile that seemed to light up the carefully controlled ambience of the restaurant. But it wasn't just her beauty that stopped him. It was something deeper, something in the way she looked directly at him, not through him or around him like so many others did. Harrison found himself momentarily speechless, a phenomenon that hadn't occurred since his first board meeting 15 years ago. "I'm sorry, what did you say your name was?" "Naomi," she repeated, and her voice had a musical quality that made him want to hear her say it again. "Can I start you off with something to drink while you wait for your lunch companion?" "Actually," Harrison heard himself saying, "I think there's been a change of plans. I'll be dining alone today." This wasn't true. Richard Hawthorne from Apex Pharmaceuticals would arrive any moment expecting to discuss the terms of a very lucrative merger. But as Harrison looked at Naomi, really looked at her, he realized he'd rather spend the next hour learning about the woman who'd just made his heart remember how to beat irregularly. Naomi tilted her head slightly, a gesture so natural and unguarded that it took Harrison's breath away. Most people calculated every movement around him, measuring words and expressions for maximum advantage. But Naomi simply existed in the moment, present and authentic in a way he'd forgotten was possible. "Well then," she said, her smile broadening, "let me tell you about today's specials." As she spoke about wine pairings and seasonal ingredients, Harrison found himself studying the way her hands moved as she gestured, the way her eyes lit up when she described the chef's signature dish, the way she seemed completely unaware of her own radiance. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or market shares or strategic positioning. He was thinking about how long it had been since someone had made him feel like a person instead of a portfolio. When Naomi finished her recitation of the menu, she looked at him expectantly, and Harrison realized he hadn't heard a single word about food. He'd been too busy memorizing the sound of her voice, the curve of her smile, the way she'd unconsciously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'll have whatever you recommend," he said finally. Naomi's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not the response she'd expected from a man who probably had very specific tastes about everything. "Are you sure? I mean, do you have any dietary restrictions or preferences I should know about?" Harrison leaned back in his chair, feeling more relaxed than he had in months. "Surprise me." As Naomi walked away to place his order, Harrison watched her navigate between tables with graceful efficiency. She had a kind word for the elderly couple in the corner, a warm laugh for the businessman who'd apparently made a joke, a gentle patience with a tourist family struggling with the wine list. She was genuine. In a world where Harrison was surrounded by people who performed sincerity like a poorly rehearsed play, Naomi simply was sincere. The realization hit him like a physical force. His phone buzzed with a text from Richard Hawthorne, running 15 minutes late. "Sorry for the delay." Harrison stared at the message, then did something he'd never done in his entire professional career. He turned off his phone. For the first time in 30 years, Harrison Reed was going to let someone else wait. The wine arrived first, a 2018 Sancerre that caught the afternoon light like liquid gold as Naomi set it carefully beside Harrison's place setting. Her movements were precise yet graceful, the kind of efficiency that spoke of thousands of hours perfecting the delicate dance of fine dining service. "The sommelier suggested this would pair beautifully with the pan-seared halibut," she said, her voice carrying that same musical quality that had stopped Harrison's world 20 minutes earlier. "But I took the liberty of asking Chef Marcus to prepare something special, our off-menu truffle risotto. It's his personal favorite." Harrison watched her pour the wine with practiced ease, noting how she held the bottle with confidence, how she instinctively knew to pour just enough for him to taste without being presumptuous. Most servers either cowered in the presence of obvious wealth or overcompensated with false familiarity. Naomi simply treated him like a person who deserved good food and attentive service. "You recommended your chef's personal favorite for a complete stranger?" Harrison asked, accepting the wine glass. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment during the exchange, and he felt something electric pass between them, a connection so unexpected and powerful that he nearly dropped the crystal stemware. Naomi's cheeks flushed slightly, a warm glow that made Harrison's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "I have a good feeling about you," she said simply, then seemed surprised by her own boldness. "I mean, you seem like someone who appreciates authenticity." The word hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Harrison set down his wine without tasting it, his full attention focused on the woman standing beside his table. In boardrooms across 3 continents, he was known as a man who could read people like balance sheets, who could spot deception and manipulation from across a room. But Naomi spoke with a transparency that was either breathtakingly naive or courageously honest. "Authenticity," he repeated, as if testing the word in his mouth. "That's becoming a rare commodity in my experience." "Maybe you've been looking in the wrong places," Naomi said, and there was something in her tone, not flirtation, exactly, but a gentle challenge that made Harrison lean forward in his chair. Before he could respond, she excused herself to check on her other tables, leaving Harrison alone with his thoughts and the untouched wine. He watched her work, noting how she remembered the elderly woman's preference for extra lemon in her water, how she patiently explained the difference between 2 nearly identical appetizers to a confused tourist, how she managed to make every interaction feel personal despite the obvious time constraints of a busy lunch service. His phone, forgotten in his jacket pocket, buzzed repeatedly with increasingly frantic messages from Richard Hawthorne. The pharmaceutical deal that had seemed so important 3 hours ago now felt as distant as yesterday's newspaper. Harrison had built his empire on the principle that every moment had a monetary value. That time was the most precious resource in the finite game of accumulating wealth. But sitting in Savoy's, watching Naomi Williams move through her domain with quiet competence and genuine warmth, Harrison discovered something revolutionary. There were moments that existed outside the economy of ambition, pockets of time that couldn't be measured in dollars or deals or quarterly projections. The risotto arrived on a pristine white plate, the truffle shavings arranged with the precision of fine art. Naomi set it before him with obvious pride, then lingered for a moment longer than service protocol required. "Chef Marcus wanted me to tell you that the truffles came in fresh this morning from Oregon," she said. "He's quite particular about sourcing." Harrison took a bite, and the flavors exploded across his palate, earthy, rich, complex in ways that reminded him of childhood Sunday dinners before his world became consumed by profit and loss statements. But more than the food itself, he was moved by the care that had gone into its preparation, the chain of attention that had brought it from kitchen to table. "It's extraordinary," he said, and meant it. "Please give my compliments to Chef Marcus." Naomi's smile was radiant. "I will. He'll be thrilled to hear that." As she turned to leave, Harrison found himself speaking before his careful businessman's filter could engage. "Naomi, wait." She paused, turning back with a questioning look that was so open, so without calculation, that Harrison felt something crack open in his chest, a door he'd welded shut decades ago. "Would you?" He stopped, suddenly aware of how this might sound, how the power dynamics of their situation could make any invitation seem inappropriate. "I'm sorry, that was." "Would I what?" Naomi asked gently, and there was no defensiveness in her voice, no assumption of impropriety. Just curiosity. Harrison set down his fork, abandoning the pretense of eating. "Would you sit with me for a moment? I know it's unusual, and I don't want to get you in trouble with your manager, but He paused, searching for words that felt true rather than strategic. "I can't remember the last time I had a conversation with someone who wasn't trying to sell me something or get something from me." Naomi glanced around the dining room, calculating. The lunch rush was winding down, her other tables were content, and Margaret was busy with a large party that had just arrived. She made a decision that surprised them both. "Just for a minute," she said, slipping into the chair across from him. The moment she sat down, the dynamic shifted entirely. They were no longer server and customer, no longer separated by the invisible boundaries of class and profession. They were simply two people sharing space and time, and the intimacy of it made Harrison's heart race in ways that hadn't happened since high school. "So," Naomi said, folding her hands on the white tablecloth, "what do you do when you're not eating truffle risotto alone in expensive restaurants?" The question was so normal, so beautifully ordinary, that Harrison almost laughed. When was the last time someone had asked him about his work without already knowing exactly who he was and what they wanted from him? "I'm in acquisitions," he said, which was technically true but deliberately vague. "I help companies find new opportunities for growth." Naomi nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds important. Do you enjoy it?" The question caught him off guard. Enjoy it? When had enjoyment become a factor in his professional life? He'd been successful, certainly. He'd been effective, profitable, strategically brilliant. But enjoyment? "It's challenging," he said finally. "What about you? Have you always wanted to work in restaurants?" A shadow crossed Naomi's face, so quickly that someone less observant might have missed it. But Harrison had spent 30 years reading micro-expressions and subtle tells, and he recognized the look of someone whose dreams were larger than their current circumstances. "It's temporary," she said with quiet dignity. "I'm saving for school. I want to be a teacher." The simple statement hit Harrison with unexpected force. Here was someone working with purpose, with a goal that had nothing to do with personal gain and everything to do with service to others. When was the last time he'd met someone whose ambitions were fundamentally generous? "What subject?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Elementary education. 3rd grade, specifically." Naomi's eyes lit up as she spoke, and Harrison saw a glimpse of the woman she would become when her dreams aligned with her reality. There's something magical about that age. They're old enough to really think and question, but young enough to still believe in possibilities. What dreams are you still chasing that others might not understand? Let us know in the comments. Harrison found himself leaning forward, drawn into her vision. "How long have you been saving?" 3 years, Naomi said. "I should have enough for tuition by next fall, if I can keep picking up extra shifts." She glanced at her watch and started to rise. "Speaking of which, I should probably—" "Please," Harrison said, and something in his voice made her pause. "Just another moment." Naomi studied his face, and Harrison had the unsettling sensation that she was seeing things he'd worked decades to hide. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the growing certainty that all his success had somehow led him further away from anything that mattered. "You look sad," she said softly, and the observation was so unexpected, so perceptive, that Harrison felt his carefully maintained composure begin to slip. "Do I?" he asked, attempting lightness. "Like someone who's forgotten how to be happy," Naomi continued, and her words were gentle but unflinchingly honest. "I see it sometimes in the customers who come in alone. They have everything they thought they wanted, but they're still looking for something." Harrison stared at her, this woman who read people's hearts as easily as he read financial statements. "And what do you think they're looking for?" "Connection," Naomi said without hesitation. "Someone to see them for who they really are, not what they have or what they can do for others." The truth of it was so stark, so completely accurate, that Harrison felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. For 30 years, he'd been chasing deals and dollars and recognition, telling himself that success would eventually translate into satisfaction. But sitting across from Naomi Williams in the soft afternoon light of Savoy's restaurant, he realized he'd been climbing the wrong mountain entirely. "You're very wise for someone so young," he said finally. Naomi smiled, and it was different from her professional server smile, warmer, more personal, touched with something that might have been affection. "My grandmother used to say that wisdom isn't about age, it's about paying attention to what matters." "And what matters?" Harrison asked. "People," Naomi said simply. "Kindness. Being present for the moments that count." She glanced around the restaurant, then back at him. Conversations with strangers who turn out not to be strangers at all. The comment hung between them, heavy with implication. Harrison felt as though he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a drop that would either destroy him or teach him how to fly. "Naomi," he said, his voice rougher than intended, "I don't even know your last name, but I feel like I've been waiting my entire life to have this conversation." Her breath caught, and for a moment, the busy restaurant around them seemed to fade into background noise. They sat in a bubble of understanding, two people who had found something unexpected and precious in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "Williams," she said quietly. "Naomi Williams." "Harrison Reed," he replied, and watched her face carefully for any sign of recognition. There was none. She had no idea who he was, how much money he had, what kind of power he wielded in the financial world. To her, he was simply Harrison, a lonely man in an expensive suit who had somehow convinced her to sit down and share a moment of authentic human connection. It was the most valuable thing anyone had given him in years. Margaret's voice cut through their reverie. "Naomi, honey, table 6 needs their check." The spell broke, but something had been created that couldn't be undone. Naomi rose gracefully, smoothing her apron, but her eyes never left Harrison's face. "I have to go," she said, but there was reluctance in her voice. "I know," Harrison replied. "But Naomi—" She paused, waiting. Would you have dinner with me? Tonight?" The words tumbled out before he could reconsider their wisdom. "Somewhere else, I mean. Away from here. As yourself, not as my server." Naomi hesitated, and Harrison saw her internal debate playing out across her expressive features. The practical concerns. He was a customer, she barely knew him, it could complicate her job. But there was something else there too, a spark of possibility that matched his own. "I get off at 6, she said finally. "I'll wait," Harrison promised. As Naomi walked away to tend to her other tables, Harrison sat back in his chair and tried to process what had just happened. In the span of an hour, his carefully ordered world had been turned completely upside down by a woman who saw him not as Harrison Reed, the billionaire CEO, but as Harrison, the man who looked sad and seemed to have forgotten how to be happy. His phone buzzed again, another message from Richard Hawthorne, probably furious about the missed meeting. Harrison looked at it, then deliberately slipped the device back into his pocket without reading the message. For the first time in 30 years, there was something more important than business. As he finished his risotto, every bite a reminder of Naomi's care in choosing it for him, Harrison realized he was about to embark on the most important acquisition of his life. Not a company or a commodity, but something infinitely more valuable and infinitely more fragile, the possibility of genuine human connection. He had 6 hours to figure out how to be worthy of it. The hours between 3 and 6 o'clock had never moved so slowly in Harrison's life. He'd returned to his office, but the quarterly reports that usually commanded his complete attention lay forgotten on his desk while he stared out at the Manhattan skyline, replaying every word of his conversation with Naomi. Harrison Reed doesn't wait for anyone, he thought. But even as the familiar voice of his business persona tried to reassert control, he knew something fundamental had shifted. The man who had built an empire on the principle that time was money was now watching the clock like a teenager waiting for his first date. His assistant, Jennifer, knocked and entered with a stack of documents requiring his signature. "Mr. Reed, the Hawthorne meeting. Should I reschedule for tomorrow?" Harrison looked up, momentarily confused. Richard Hawthorne and the pharmaceutical acquisition felt like something from another lifetime, though it had been only hours since he'd abandoned the lunch that was supposed to seal a $100 million deal. "Cancel it entirely," Harrison said, surprising them both. "Send my apologies and tell him we're not interested in moving forward." Jennifer's carefully maintained professional composure cracked slightly. "Sir, this acquisition has been in development for 6 months. The board is expecting." "The board will survive," Harrison interrupted, then caught himself. Jennifer had been with him for 8 years, and she'd never seen him make a decision this impulsive. "I'm sorry, that was abrupt. Something more important has come up." More important than $100 million. The words would have been incomprehensible to him that morning. After Jennifer left, Harrison found himself doing something he hadn't done since college. He Googled himself. Page after page of Forbes articles, Wall Street Journal profiles, and business magazine covers filled his screen. Harrison Reed, the acquisition king. Harrison Reed, the man with the Midas touch. Harrison Reed, New York's most eligible bachelor, a title that had always made him uncomfortable, reducing his worth to his wealth and his single status to a marketing opportunity. But nowhere in the digital catalog of his achievements did he find Harrison the man who appreciated authenticity, Harrison who looked sad, Harrison who seemed to have forgotten how to be happy. Naomi had seen something in 30 minutes that the financial press had missed in 15 years of coverage. The thought of her brought a smile to his face, the first genuine smile he could remember in months. She would be finishing her shift soon, changing out of her server's uniform, maybe wondering if he would actually be there waiting as he'd promised. The possibility that she might not show up hit him like a physical blow. Why would she? He was a customer who had monopolized her time during a busy lunch service, who had probably made her uncomfortable with his intensity, who represented everything about wealth and privilege that might reasonably make a working woman suspicious. Harrison had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat, but the thought of Naomi deciding he wasn't worth her evening made his hands shake. At 5:30, he left his office. Meanwhile, in the employee break room at Savoy's, Naomi stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink and tried to convince herself she wasn't making a terrible mistake. "Girl, you look like you've seen a ghost," said Carmen, the hostess, as she touched up her lipstick in the adjacent mirror. "Bad tables today." "No, actually," Naomi said, pulling the pins from her hair and letting it fall in soft waves around her shoulders. "Good tables. Maybe too good." Carmen raised an eyebrow. "There's no such thing as too good when it comes to tips, honey." Naomi smiled, but her expression remained troubled. How could she explain that Harrison Reed, the man with the sad eyes and expensive suit, had somehow made her feel more seen and understood in one conversation than most people managed in months of acquaintance? She changed out of her uniform and into her own clothes, dark jeans, a soft cream sweater, and the leather jacket she'd found at a thrift store in Brooklyn and loved despite its worn edges. Looking at herself in the civilian clothes, she tried to imagine what Harrison would see when she walked out of the restaurant as herself, not as his server. Would he still be interested in the woman without the professional smile and deferential manner? Would she still seem worth waiting for when she wasn't bringing him artfully plated food and carefully selected wines? "You got a date?" Carmen asked, noticing Naomi's careful attention to her appearance. Maybe, Naomi said. I'm not sure what to call it. Well, whoever he is, he's lucky. You look beautiful, Mija. Naomi checked her watch. 5:55. Her stomach fluttered with nerves she hadn't felt since high school. This was ridiculous. She was 26 years old, a grown woman who had survived 3 years in New York City service industry. She could handle one dinner with one man, no matter how much his attention had affected her. But as she gathered her purse and headed for the employee exit, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that this evening would change everything. Harrison stood outside Savoy's at exactly 6 o'clock, having spent the previous 10 minutes walking around the block to avoid looking too eager. The early October air carried the first hint of autumn chill, and the Manhattan sidewalks buzzed with the energy of people heading home from work or out for the evening. He changed clothes too, trading his business suit for dark slacks and a cashmere sweater that somehow felt both more casual and more vulnerable. Without his armor of expensive tailoring and obvious success markers, he felt strangely exposed. What if she doesn't come? The thought had been circling his mind for the past hour. What if she changed her mind? What if this whole thing was just politeness, the kind of service industry courtesy that makes customers feel special without meaning anything real? At 6:03, the employee door opened, and Naomi emerged. Harrison's breath caught in his throat. If she had been beautiful in her server's uniform, she was absolutely radiant in her own clothes. The professional competence was still there, but now he could see the woman beneath, younger, softer, with an easy grace that spoke of confidence earned rather than performed. She spotted him immediately and smiled, and Harrison felt his heart do something acrobatic in his chest. "You waited," she said, and there was surprise in her voice, as if she genuinely expected him to reconsider. "I said I would," Harrison replied, then added more softly, "Wild horses couldn't have kept me away." Naomi's cheeks flushed pink, and she ducked her head in a gesture so natural and unguarded that Harrison wanted to memorize it. "So," she said, "where exactly does a man like you take a woman like me for dinner in New York City?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications about class and expectation and the vast gulf that supposedly separated their worlds. Harrison had reservations at half a dozen restaurants where tables cost more than Naomi probably made in a week, places where his name alone could secure the best seats and the chef's personal attention. But looking at her, really looking at the woman who had seen through his wealth to something true underneath, he realized that impressing her with money would be the worst possible strategy. "How do you feel about food trucks?" he asked. Naomi's eyebrows shot up. "Food trucks? There's a Venezuelan place that parks near Washington Square Park. Best RPAR in the city, according to my building's doorman, who I trust more than any restaurant critic." Harrison paused, suddenly uncertain. "Unless you'd prefer something more traditional." "No," Naomi said, and her smile was brilliant. "Food trucks sound perfect. What's the most unexpectedly perfect date you've ever been on? Share your story below." As they walked toward the subway station, Harrison found himself studying Naomi with the intensity he usually reserved for merger documents. She moved through the city with the fluid confidence of someone who belonged here, who had navigated these streets long enough to know which subway entrances to avoid and which food vendors actually wash their hands. "How long have you lived in New York?" he asked as they descended into the 42nd Street station. 4 years, Naomi said, swiping her Metro card with practiced ease. "Came here right after college with 2 suitcases and about $300 to my name." Harrison tried to imagine that kind of courage, leaving everything familiar with no safety net, no trust fund, no family connections to smooth the way. His own path to New York had been paved with Harvard Business School credentials and his father's investment banking contacts. "That must have been terrifying," he said. "Terrifying and exhilarating," Naomi agreed as they waited for the downtown train. "Everything was possible, you know? Every day felt like an adventure, even when I was eating ramen for the 5th night in a row." The train arrived, crowded with the usual mix of commuters, tourists, and city dwellers heading out for the evening. Harrison automatically reached for his phone to summon a car service, then stopped himself. When was the last time he'd ridden the subway? When was the last time he'd done anything that ordinary people did as a matter of course? They found seats near the back, and as the train rocked through the tunnels beneath Manhattan, Harrison became aware of how different this was from his usual evening routine. No driver, no private dining room, no agenda beyond spending time with someone whose company he craved. "Can I ask you something?" Naomi said, turning to face him more fully. "Anything. Why did you ask me to dinner? I mean, really. You could probably have your pick of women in this city." The directness of the question caught Harrison off guard. Most people in his world specialized in subtext and implication, dancing around difficult topics with elaborate verbal choreography. But Naomi's honesty demanded an equally honest response. "Because you looked at me," he said finally. "Not at my watch or my suit or the credit card I used to pay the check. You looked at me and saw something that needed seeing." Naomi studied his face as the train pulled into their station. "And what did I see?" Harrison stood and offered her his hand as they prepared to exit. "Someone who's forgotten how to be happy," he said, echoing her words from the restaurant. "Someone who spent so long acquiring things that he forgot to acquire a life worth living." They emerged from the subway into Washington Square Park, where the evening light was beginning to fade and the Venezuelan food truck glowed like a beacon near the fountain. The park was alive with the energy of a warm October evening. Street musicians playing for tips, couples sharing benches, children chasing pigeons despite their parents' protests. "Harrison," Naomi said as they walked toward the truck, "what do you do?" "Really, I mean, acquisitions covers a lot of territory." Here it was, the moment of truth. He could continue the careful fiction, keep his identity vague until she knew him well enough to see past the numbers. Or he could trust her with the whole complicated truth and hope that her interest in Harrison the man could survive learning about Harrison the billionaire. "I buy companies," he said, choosing a middle path. "When businesses are struggling or families want to sell, I acquire them and either improve them or integrate them into larger operations." It was accurate without being complete, honest without being overwhelming. Naomi nodded thoughtfully as they joined the short line at the food truck. "That sounds like it could be either very helpful or very destructive, depending on how you approach it." The observation was so perceptive, so exactly right, that Harrison found himself laughing, a real laugh, the kind that came from surprise and recognition rather than social obligation. "You're absolutely right," he said. "I try to be helpful, but I'm not always sure I succeed." They ordered their food, arpa stuffed with black beans and cheese, sweet plantains on the side, and found a bench near the fountain where they could watch the city's evening entertainment unfold around them. Harrison bit into his arepa and was surprised by how good it was, how the simple combination of corn flour and filling could be so satisfying. "Your doorman has excellent taste," Naomi said, smiling as she watched his reaction. "Better than most of the expensive restaurants I frequent," Harrison admitted. "When did I become someone who forgot that the best things in life are usually the simplest?" "Maybe when you started measuring everything by its price tag instead of its worth," Naomi suggested gently. The comment stung because it was true. Harrison had spent so many years in a world where value was determined by scarcity and expense that he'd lost touch with the kinds of pleasure that couldn't be purchased. Conversations with strangers, meals shared on park benches, the simple satisfaction of food that was good because it was made with care rather than costly ingredients. As they ate, Naomi told him about her students from her tutoring job, about the 9-year-old who had finally grasped long division and celebrated by doing a victory dance around the library. Harrison found himself sharing stories too, not the sanitized anecdotes from board meetings and investor presentations, but real memories of growing up, of the grandfather who had taught him to fish, of the college roommate who had talked him through his first heartbreak. When was the last time he'd talked about his grandfather? When was the last time he'd even thought about those summer afternoons by the lake, learning patience and presence from a man who measured success in stories shared rather than dollars earned. "You miss him," Naomi observed, watching his expression. "Every day," Harrison said, surprised by the admission. "He died when I was in graduate school, and I was too busy with internships and case studies to spend much time with him toward the end. I keep thinking I'll make it up to him somehow, but you can't apologize to someone who's gone." Naomi reached across the small space between them and touched his hand, a brief, gentle contact that somehow conveyed more comfort than hours of expensive therapy. "Maybe the way you honor him is by remembering what he taught you about what matters," she said. As darkness fell over Washington Square Park and the streetlights began to flicker on, Harrison realized that this, sitting on a bench with a woman who saw him clearly, eating simple food and having the most honest conversation he'd had in years, was the closest he'd felt to happy in longer than he could remember. But underneath the contentment, a shadow of anxiety was growing. How long could this last? How long before she learned who he really was, what kind of world he inhabited, what expectations and complications came with his level of wealth? How long before reality intruded on this perfect bubble of connection they'd created? The thought of losing this, losing her, before he'd even really found it made his chest tighten with something dangerously close to panic. He was falling in love with Naomi Williams, and he had no idea how to do it without destroying everything. 3 weeks had passed since their first evening in Washington Square Park, and Harrison Reed was living 2 lives. By day, he was still the billionaire CEO who commanded boardrooms and closed impossible deals. But every evening at 6 o'clock, he became someone else entirely, a man who waited outside restaurants and coffee shops and little theaters in Brooklyn, watching for the woman who had somehow rewired his understanding of what it meant to be alive. They had seen each other 12 times. Harrison could count each encounter like a miser counting coins, hoarding the memories of walks through Central Park, late dinners at tiny ethnic restaurants Naomi discovered in her explorations of the city, afternoons spent in bookstores where she would read him passages from novels he'd never heard of while he watched the way her face lit up with ideas. But the deception was killing him. Every time Naomi mentioned her careful budgeting, her excitement about finally having enough saved for school, her worry about whether she could afford both tuition and rent, Harrison felt the weight of his hidden wealth like a stone in his chest. He wanted to tell her that he could solve all her problems with a single phone call, that her dreams of teaching didn't have to wait for slowly accumulated savings. But he also knew that revealing his true identity would change everything between them, possibly destroy it entirely. The woman who saw him as simply Harrison, sad, lonely Harrison who had forgotten how to be happy, might disappear forever, replaced by someone who saw him as Harrison Reed the billionaire, with all the complications and suspicions that knowledge would bring. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, the careful balance he'd been maintaining was about to collapse. Harrison stood in his penthouse apartment, staring at the invitation in his hands. The annual philanthropic gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York's most exclusive charity event, where the city's elite gathered to see and be seen while writing tax-deductible checks for causes they'd forget by morning. He was expected to attend. More than expected, he was one of the event's primary sponsors, and his absence would be noted by every gossip columnist and society photographer in the city. But accepting meant stepping back into the world of wealth and privilege he'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. The world where Harrison Reed the acquisition king was celebrated and Harrison the man who loved a waitress from Brooklyn was invisible. His phone buzzed with a text from Naomi, working late tonight. Rain check on dinner. Tomorrow maybe. Relief and disappointment warred in his chest. He wouldn't have to choose between her and his obligations tonight, but the reprieve only delayed the inevitable reckoning that was coming. Harrison set down the invitation and called his driver. The Metropolitan Museum of Art had been transformed for the evening into a glittering palace of Manhattan's social elite. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the Egyptian wing, where cocktail tables draped in cream silk created intimate conversation areas among ancient artifacts. The guest list read like a who's who of New York power: politicians, celebrities, tech moguls, and old money dynasties whose names graced hospital wings and university buildings. Harrison moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting congratulations on his latest acquisition, deflecting questions about his love life, and writing checks with amounts that would have seemed incomprehensible to him just a month ago. But everything felt hollow, performative, like he was watching someone else play the role of Harrison Reed while the real Harrison, the man who had discovered joy in park benches and food trucks, remained locked away. "Harrison, darling." The voice belonged to Victoria Ashford, a stunning blonde socialite whose family owned half of the Upper East Side. She approached with the predatory grace of someone who had been circling him at events like this for the better part of a decade. "You've been absolutely invisible lately. I was beginning to think you'd left the city." "Just busy with work," Harrison replied automatically, accepting her air-kissed greeting with the kind of detached politeness that had become second nature. "Well, you simply must make time for pleasure," Victoria said, her hand lingering on his arm longer than casual contact required. "I'm having a small gathering next weekend at the Hamptons house. Just 30 or 40 of our closest friends. You should come." Harrison nodded non-committally, his attention drifting to the other guests. Everywhere he looked, he saw wealth performing itself. Designer gowns that cost more than most people's annual salaries, jewelry that could fund small countries, conversations that revolved around yacht specifications and private jet maintenance schedules. How had he never noticed how exhausting it all was? The constant need to be on, to play the role of successful bachelor, to treat human connections like networking opportunities. "Harrison Reed." The voice cut through his reverie like a blade. He turned to see Richard Hawthorne approaching, flanked by two men Harrison recognized as pharmaceutical industry executives. The man whose lunch meeting he'd abandoned 3 weeks ago, whose $100 million deal he'd walked away from without explanation. "Richard," Harrison said carefully, "good to see you." "Is it?" Hawthorne's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Because I have to say, your sudden disappearance from our negotiations was quite unexpected. My board was very disappointed." The words carried an undertone of threat that made several nearby conversations pause. In the shark-infested waters of Manhattan high finance, showing weakness or unpredictability could be fatal to one's reputation. "Sometimes priorities shift," Harrison said evenly. "I'm sure you understand." "Actually, I don't," Hawthorne pressed, his voice carrying far enough that others began to take notice. "Harrison Reed doesn't just vanish from major deals. Harrison Reed doesn't turn off his phone during crucial negotiations. Unless, of course, there's something more important than business occupying his attention." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Harrison felt the weight of dozens of eyes, the barely concealed hunger of people who thrived on scandal and weakness among their peers. "There's always something more important than business, Richard," Harrison said quietly. "I'm surprised it took me this long to remember that." Before Hawthorne could respond, Harrison excused himself and walked toward the museum's grand staircase, needing air, needing space, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere of wealth and judgment that had once felt like home. But as he climbed the stairs toward the quieter second-floor galleries, his phone rang. The caller ID made his blood freeze. Savoy's restaurant. "Hello, Mr. Reed." The voice belonged to Margaret, Naomi's floor manager. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but Naomi gave me your number as an emergency contact, and we have a situation." Harrison's heart stopped. What kind of situation? Is she hurt? "She collapsed during the dinner service. We called an ambulance, but she's conscious now and refusing to go to the hospital. She says she can't afford it, and she's being very stubborn about it. I thought maybe you could talk to her." The phone nearly slipped from Harrison's hand. "Which hospital?" "Mount Sinai, but Mr. Reed, she's not." Harrison was already moving, taking the museum steps 2 at a time, his expensive tuxedo forgotten as he pushed through the crowd toward the exit. "Tell her I'm coming," he said into the phone. "Tell her everything's going to be okay." Mount Sinai's emergency room was a universe away from the glittering charity gala. Harsh fluorescent lights, plastic chairs that had seen better decades, and the constant hum of crisis and recovery that defined urban healthcare. Harrison burst through the automatic doors, still wearing his tuxedo, drawing stares from patients and staff alike. "Naomi Williams," he said to the reception nurse, his voice tight with panic. She was brought in from Savoy's restaurant. The nurse consulted her computer with maddening slowness. "Are you family?" "I'm." Harrison paused, realizing he had no official claim to information about Naomi's condition. "I'm someone who cares about her very much." Something in his expression must have moved the nurse, because she directed him to the waiting area with instructions that someone would update him soon. Harrison paced the small space like a caged animal, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios and self-recriminations. Why hadn't he noticed she wasn't well? Had she been working too hard, pushing herself to save money for school? Had her stubborn independence prevented her from seeking medical care she needed but couldn't afford? Have you ever realized how much someone meant to you only when you thought you might lose them? Tell us about it in the comments. Mr. Reed. Harrison spun around to find a young doctor in scrubs approaching him. "Is she okay? Can I see her?" "She's stable," the doctor said, and Harrison felt his knees go weak with relief. Severe dehydration and exhaustion, combined with low blood sugar. "She tells me she's been working double shifts and not eating regularly to save money. It's not uncommon in young adults trying to make ends meet in this city." Guilt hit Harrison like a physical blow. While he'd been falling in love with Naomi's strength and independence, she'd been literally starving herself to achieve her dreams. He could have helped, could have made her life easier in a dozen different ways, but his fear of revealing his wealth had kept him silent while she suffered. "Can I see her?" he asked again. The doctor hesitated. "She's been asking for you, actually. But I should warn you, she's pretty upset about the medical bills. We tried to explain that there are assistance programs, but she's worried about the cost." Harrison nodded, his jaw tight with determination. "I'll handle the bills. All of them. Whatever it takes." "Sir, I don't think you understand. Even with insurance, emergency room visits can be." "Doctor," Harrison interrupted, pulling out his Black American Express card, "I assure you that money is not an issue. Whatever she needs, whatever this costs, I'll cover it. Just please take care of her." The doctor's eyes widened as he recognized the exclusive credit card, the kind that came with no preset spending limit and required a 7-figure annual income to obtain. "Yes, sir. Of course. She's in bed 12. Harrison walked through the emergency room maze, his heart pounding with something that felt like terror and hope combined. When he pushed aside the curtain around bed 12, he found Naomi sitting up against thin hospital pillows, looking pale and fragile in a way that made his chest ache. "Harrison," she said, and her voice broke on his name. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want anyone to call you, but Margaret insisted, and I." "Sure," Harrison said, moving to her bedside and taking her hand in both of his. "Don't apologize. I'm here, and everything's going to be okay." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. "I can't afford this, Harrison. I don't know how I'm going to pay for this. All my savings for school." "No," Harrison said firmly. "Don't worry about money. Don't worry about any of that." "But you don't understand," Naomi continued, the words tumbling out in a rush of exhaustion and fear. "I've been working 16-hour days, picking up every extra shift I can get, because I'm so close to having enough for tuition. And now this, the ambulance alone probably costs more than I make in a week, and the hospital bills." "Naomi, stop." Harrison's voice was gentle but commanding. "I'm taking care of the bills. All of them." She stared at him, confusion replacing panic in her dark eyes. "What do you mean, you're taking care of them? Harrison, these bills could be thousands of dollars. Your job in acquisitions, it's good, but it's not." I need to tell you something, Harrison interrupted, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't how he'd planned to reveal his identity, but watching her suffer while he had the power to help was unbearable. About who I am. About what I do. Naomi went very still, some instinct warning her that whatever Harrison was about to say would change everything between them. My name is Harrison Reed, he began, then paused, gathering courage for the words that might save her or destroy them both. And I'm not just in acquisitions. I own Reed Industries. I'm worth more money than I know what to do with. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison watched Naomi's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning understanding that made her pull her hand away from his. You're Harrison Reed, she said slowly. The Harrison Reed. The billionaire. Yes. The man on the cover of Forbes magazine last month. Yes. Naomi closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something had changed. Something precious had been lost in the space between one heartbeat and the next. How long? She asked quietly. How long what? How long have you been lying to me? The word lying hit Harrison like a slap. I wasn't lying, exactly. I just... You let me worry about money, Naomi continued, her voice growing stronger and colder with each word. You watched me count dollars and stress about bills and work myself into the hospital, and you never said anything. You have more money than some countries, and you let me suffer. I wanted you to know me, Harrison said desperately. The real me, not the money. I was afraid that if you knew. You were afraid I'd want your money. Naomi's laugh was sharp and bitter. So instead you decided to play dress up, to pretend to be normal while I nearly killed myself trying to make ends meet. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Harrison? Naomi sat up straighter in the hospital bed, and despite her weakness, she radiated a strength that was formidable. Were you slumming? Having a little adventure with the poor waitress who was too stupid to recognize New York's most famous bachelor? No. Harrison's voice cracked with desperation. Naomi, please, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, she said, and the contempt in her voice was worse than anger would have been. You're just like every other rich man who thinks money gives you the right to manipulate people's lives. You could have helped me, could have saved me months of struggle, but you chose your own comfort over my well-being. Harrison felt everything he'd built with her crumbling like sand. I love you, he said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. I love you, and I was terrified that telling you the truth would ruin everything between us. Well, congratulations, Naomi said, turning her face away from him. Your fear of ruining everything has ruined everything. The finality in her voice made Harrison's world tilt on its axis. Naomi, please. Get out, she said quietly. Pay your bills if it makes you feel better about yourself, but get out and don't come back. Harrison stood frozen beside her bed, watching the woman he loved shut him out of her life. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to stay, to find the words that would bridge the chasm his deception had created. But looking at Naomi, really looking at her, he saw something he'd never noticed before. Beneath her gentleness and warmth was a core of steel, a dignity that his wealth and manipulation had wounded in ways that might never heal. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry, Naomi. I never meant to hurt you. She didn't respond, didn't even look at him, and Harrison realized that sometimes love meant knowing when to walk away. He left his credit card with the billing department, ensuring that every expense would be covered, that Naomi's medical care wouldn't cost her a penny. Then he walked out into the cold October night, still wearing his tuxedo, carrying the shattered remains of the only happiness he'd ever known. 3 weeks later, Harrison received a cashier's check in the mail for the exact amount of Naomi's medical bills, along with a note written in her careful handwriting. I don't want to owe you anything. N. He never cashed the check. 6 months later, Harrison Reed stood in the conference room of the Children's Foundation of New York, staring at a proposal that would have been impossible to imagine a year ago. The foundation's director, Maria Santos, watched him expectantly as he reviewed the documents spread across the polished table. The Naomi Williams Education Initiative, Harrison read aloud, his voice catching slightly on her name. Full scholarships for working adults pursuing teaching degrees, with living stipends to ensure they don't have to choose between education and survival. It's ambitious, Maria admitted. The initial funding would need to be substantial, enough to support at least 50 students per year through their entire degree programs. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar commitment. Harrison set down the papers and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The trees were in full spring bloom, their green canopies alive with the promise of new beginnings. Somewhere in this city, Naomi was living her life, teaching, he hoped, or at least pursuing her dreams without the crushing weight of financial stress he could have prevented. He tried to find out, of course. Discreet inquiries through mutual acquaintances at Savoy's had revealed that she'd left the restaurant shortly after their confrontation in the hospital, but beyond that, his sources had gone cold. Naomi Williams had effectively disappeared from his world, leaving only the memory of her warmth and the echoing shame of his deception. Mr. Reed. Maria's voice brought him back to the present. The board is very excited about this proposal, but we need to know if you're serious about the funding. Harrison turned from the window, his decision already made. I'll provide the initial endowment, $25 million to start. The foundation can manage the scholarships, but I have one condition. Maria's eyebrows rose. What kind of condition? My involvement remains anonymous. The recipients should never know where the funding comes from. And if anyone asks, you've never heard of Harrison Reed. It was the least he could do, and perhaps the most. If he couldn't undo the harm he'd caused Naomi, he could at least ensure that other people in her situation wouldn't have to choose between their dreams and their survival. After leaving the foundation offices, Harrison found himself walking aimlessly through the city streets. 6 months of therapy had helped him understand the patterns that had led to his deception, the fear of being valued only for his wealth, the loneliness that had made him desperate to be seen as simply human. But understanding his motivations didn't ease the ache of losing the only woman who had ever truly known him. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Board meeting in 20 minutes. Conference room A. Harrison sighed and hailed a taxi. Reed Industries still demanded his attention, still required the strategic thinking and ruthless decision-making that had built his empire. But increasingly, he found himself questioning the purpose of accumulating more wealth when he had no one meaningful to share it with. The board meeting was routine, quarterly projections, acquisition targets, market analysis. Harrison participated with his usual competence, but part of his mind wandered to the scholarship fund he'd just established. Would it reach the right people? Would it make the difference he hoped it would? As the meeting concluded, Harrison's CFO, James Patterson, lingered behind. Harrison, can I speak with you privately? They waited until the conference room was empty before James closed the door and took a seat across from his boss. I've been with this company for 8 years, James began, and I've never seen you as distracted as you've been lately. The Hawthorne deal, the pharmaceutical merger you walked away from, now this foundation initiative. It's like you're not the same person. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying his CFO's concerned expression. James was one of the few people in his professional life who spoke to him with genuine honesty rather than calculated deference. Maybe I'm not the same person, Harrison said finally. Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Look, I don't know what happened 6 months ago, but you've been different ever since. More. I don't know, human? You ask about our families now. You remember our kids' names. You even sent flowers when my father was in the hospital. Harrison smiled slightly. Those sound like positive changes. They are, James agreed. But there's something else. You seem sad. Like you're going through the motions, but your heart isn't in it anymore. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Harrison had been successful in maintaining his professional responsibilities, but the passion that had once driven him to work 18-hour days and pursue impossible deals had dimmed to barely a flicker. "James, can I ask you something? How do you know when you've found the right person?" His CFO looked surprised by the personal turn in their conversation. "You mean romantically?" "I mean the person who makes you want to be better than you are. The person who sees through all your defenses and likes what they find underneath." James was quiet for a long moment. "I think you know when losing them would be worse than never having met them at all," he said finally. "But you also know when you'd rather have them happy without you than miserable with you." The words hit Harrison like a revelation. For 6 months, he'd been focused on his own pain, his own regret, his own desire to somehow undo the damage he'd caused. But what about Naomi's happiness? What about her dreams and aspirations that had nothing to do with him? "James," Harrison said suddenly, an idea forming, "what do you know about education policy in New York City?" The Brooklyn Community College campus was bustling with the energy of a new semester. Students hurried between buildings with backpacks and coffee cups, their faces bright with a particular combination of hope and anxiety that marked the beginning of academic adventures. Naomi Williams walked across the courtyard with a confidence that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Her teaching credential program had been more challenging than she'd anticipated, but also more rewarding. The scholarship that had appeared mysteriously in her financial aid package, covering not just tuition but living expenses, had allowed her to focus entirely on her studies for the first time in her adult life. She still didn't know where the emergency education fund had come from. The financial aid office had been vague about the details, mentioning only that it was administered by the Children's Foundation of New York and funded by an anonymous donor. Naomi had initially been suspicious. She'd learned to be wary of unexpected gifts, but thorough investigation had revealed no strings attached, no hidden agendas. Someone, somewhere, had simply decided that her dreams were worth supporting. Now, 3 weeks away from graduation, Naomi carried herself with the quiet pride of someone who had overcome significant obstacles through her own determination and the mysterious kindness of strangers. Her student teaching assignment at PS 234 in Crown Heights had confirmed everything she'd believed about her calling. She was born to be in a classroom, guiding young minds and nurturing potential. "Miss Williams." Naomi turned to see Dr. Rebecca Chen, her mentor teacher, approaching with a wide smile. "I have wonderful news," Dr. Chen continued. "The principal at PS 234 wants to offer you a full-time position for next fall. 3rd grade, just like you hoped." Naomi's heart leaped. After everything she'd been through, the long nights at Savoy's, the exhaustion, the heartbreak, the slow rebuild of her life, she was finally going to achieve her dream. That's incredible," she managed. "I can't believe it's really happening." "Believe it," Dr. Chen laughed. "You're going to be an exceptional teacher, Naomi. Those kids are lucky to have you." As they walked toward the education building, Dr. Chen mentioned something that made Naomi pause. "By the way, there's a small ceremony next week for scholarship recipients. The Children's Foundation is hosting it. Apparently they want to celebrate this year's graduates. You should come." Naomi nodded absently, her mind already racing ahead to lesson plans and classroom decorations and all the ways she would create a learning environment where every child felt valued and seen. What moment in your life made you realize you were exactly where you were supposed to be? Share your story below. The scholarship ceremony was held in a small event space near Lincoln Center, decorated with flowers and filled with the proud families of graduating students. Naomi wore her best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, and felt slightly overwhelmed by the formal atmosphere. She'd been expecting a brief presentation, maybe some remarks from foundation staff about the importance of education. What she hadn't expected was to see Harrison Reed standing near the back of the room, looking as shocked to see her as she was to see him. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the crowded space. Harrison looked different. Thinner, perhaps, with lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult reckonings. But there was something else, something that reminded her of the man she'd first met in Savoy's restaurant. Vulnerable, searching, achingly real. Naomi's first instinct was to leave. The sight of Harrison brought back all the pain of his deception, all the anger she'd felt at being manipulated and lied to. But she was also curious. What was Harrison Reed doing at a ceremony for education scholarships? The program began before she could decide whether to approach him or flee. Maria Santos, the foundation director, took the podium and began speaking about the power of education to transform lives and communities. This year, we're proud to have supported 67 students in their pursuit of teaching degrees, Maria announced. These remarkable individuals have demonstrated not only academic excellence, but the kind of character and determination that will make them exceptional educators. As Maria continued, calling up various scholarship recipients to be recognized, Naomi found herself glancing repeatedly toward the back of the room. Harrison remained there, partially hidden behind a pillar, but his attention was completely focused on the stage. When Naomi's name was called, she walked to the front with as much composure as she could manage. Maria presented her with a certificate and spoke briefly about her outstanding student teaching evaluations, but Naomi barely heard the words. She could feel Harrison's eyes on her, and despite everything that had happened between them, the intensity of his attention still had the power to make her heart race. After the ceremony, as families mingled and took photographs, Naomi found herself approached by Maria Santos. "Naomi, I'm so glad you could be here tonight," Maria said warmly. "I have to tell you, your scholarship generated quite a bit of interest from our donors. Someone was very invested in your success." "What do you mean?" Naomi asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "Well, I probably shouldn't say this, but your scholarship was actually individually funded. Someone specifically requested that we support a working adult pursuing elementary education, someone who had demonstrated exceptional resilience in the face of financial hardship." Naomi's stomach dropped. "Do you know who?" Maria glanced around, then leaned closer. "I'm not supposed to reveal donor identities, but since he's here tonight, it was Harrison Reed. He established the entire education initiative after meeting someone who inspired him to think differently about how wealth should be used." The world seemed to tilt around Naomi. Harrison had funded her scholarship. Harrison, whose deception had shattered her heart, had also been quietly supporting her dreams for the past 6 months. "He's been asking about you," Maria continued. "Not intrusively, just wanting to make sure you were succeeding, that the program was meeting your needs. I think he cares about you very much." Before Naomi could respond, Maria was called away by other donors, leaving her alone with her spinning thoughts. She looked toward the back of the room, but Harrison was gone. Outside the event space, Naomi found him standing beside the fountain in Lincoln Center Plaza, staring up at the evening sky as if searching for answers in the stars. "You funded my scholarship," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet space. Harrison turned, and she saw something in his expression she'd never seen before, not the confidence of wealth or the charm of seduction, but a raw vulnerability that made her chest ache. "I couldn't undo what I'd done," he said simply, "but I could try to make sure your dreams didn't suffer because of my mistakes." Naomi walked closer, studying his face in the soft light from the plaza lamps. "For 6 months, you've been supporting me anonymously. Why?" "Because you were right," Harrison said. "About everything. I let my fear of being judged for my wealth prevent me from helping when I could have. I let you struggle because I was more concerned with protecting my own feelings than with your well-being. So the scholarship was guilt money." The words came out sharper than Naomi had intended. "No," Harrison said firmly. "The scholarship was love money. It was me realizing that loving someone means wanting their happiness even when you can't be part of it." The honesty in his voice broke something open in Naomi's chest, something that had been locked away since that night in the hospital. "I've missed you," she said quietly. "I've been angry at you, disappointed in you, but underneath all of that, I've missed you every single day." Harrison's breath caught. "Naomi." "I got a job," she continued. "Third grade at PS 234 in Crown Heights. I start in the fall." "That's wonderful," Harrison said, and the genuine joy in his voice was unmistakable. "You're going to be an incredible teacher." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid settling between them like snow. "I learned something these past 6 months," Naomi said finally, "about forgiveness and second chances and what it means to really know someone." "What did you learn?" "I learned that the man who lied to me about his wealth was the same man who spent 6 months quietly supporting my dreams without expecting anything in return. I learned that people are complicated, that good people can make terrible mistakes, and that sometimes love means finding your way back to each other despite the damage." Harrison took a step closer, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I love you," Naomi interrupted. Not Harrison Reed the billionaire, not Harrison the man who pretended to be someone else, but Harrison the person who saw me in that restaurant and made me feel worthy of being seen. The man who's been learning how to be better, how to use his resources to help others instead of just accumulating more for himself. "I love you too," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've loved you since that first afternoon when you recommended the truffle risotto and looked at me like I was worth saving." "You were," Naomi said, reaching for his hand. "You are." As Harrison pulled her into his arms, Naomi felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Not because Harrison could solve her problems or fund her dreams, but because he saw her completely and loved her anyway. "So what happens now?" Harrison asked, holding her close. Naomi smiled, thinking of her classroom waiting for her in the fall, of the children she would teach and inspire, of the life she had built through her own determination and the mysterious generosity of strangers who turned out not to be strangers at all. "Now we figure out how to build something real together," she said. "Something based on truth and trust and the kind of love that makes both people better." Harrison kissed her then, soft and sure beneath the New York stars, and Naomi knew that sometimes the best endings were actually beginnings in disguise. The third grade classroom at PS 234 was alive with the chatter of 23 8-year-olds discussing their weekend adventures. Naomi Williams, soon to be Naomi Reed, stood at the front of the room, her hand resting unconsciously on the simple engagement ring Harrison had given her the week before. "Miss Williams," called out Jaden, a precocious boy with gap teeth and boundless curiosity, "my mom says you're marrying a prince. Is that true?" Naomi laughed, the sound bright and genuine in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the classroom windows. "Not a prince, Jaden. Just a man who loves me very much." "Does he have a castle?" asked Sophia, another student. "He has a very nice apartment," Naomi admitted. "But what's most important is that he has a good heart." Through the classroom window, she could see Harrison waiting in the schoolyard, surrounded by a small crowd of curious children who had discovered that Miss Williams' fiancé was always good for stories and occasionally brought books for the school library. He looked different than he had a year ago, more relaxed, more present, genuinely happy in a way that had nothing to do with stock prices or acquisition targets. The Children's Foundation had become his primary focus, expanding beyond education to encompass housing assistance, healthcare access, and job training programs. But perhaps more importantly, he had learned to find joy in simple things. Sunday morning breakfasts with Naomi, helping her grade papers, attending school events where he was simply Miss Williams' boyfriend rather than Harrison Reed the billionaire. As the final bell rang and students gathered their backpacks, Naomi felt the familiar satisfaction of another day spent shaping young minds and nurturing potential. This was what she had worked for, dreamed of, sacrificed for, and it was even better than she had imagined. "Miss Williams." Sophia approached her desk as the other children filed out. Are you going to be happy forever now? Naomi knelt down to Sophia's eye level, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think happiness isn't something you achieve once and keep forever, she said gently. I think it's something you choose every day, and something you build with people who care about you. Sophia nodded solemnly, then brightened. Well, you look really happy today. As Sophia skipped out to join her classmates, Naomi gathered her lesson plans and headed for the door. Harrison was waiting for her by the school entrance, his face lighting up when he saw her in a way that still made her heart skip. How was your day, teacher? He asked, falling into step beside her. Perfect, Naomi said, and meant it. Absolutely perfect. As they walked home together through the bustling streets of Brooklyn, past bodegas and playgrounds and all the ordinary magic of city life, Naomi reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a waitress with impossible dreams. Now she was a teacher with a classroom full of students who looked to her for guidance and inspiration. But more than that, she was a woman who had learned that love, real love, wasn't about fairy tale endings or perfect beginnings. It was about two imperfect people choosing each other every day, building something beautiful from the raw materials of honesty, forgiveness, and hope. I have something to tell you, Harrison said as they reached their brownstone, the home they had chosen together in Park Slope, close enough to Naomi's school that she could walk to work, but spacious enough for the family they both hoped to have someday. Good news or bad news? Naomi asked, unlocking the front door. The best news, Harrison said, his eyes dancing with excitement. The Foundation Board approved funding for your literacy initiative. Starting next fall, PS234 will have a fully funded after-school reading program, complete with new books, tutoring support, and family engagement activities. Naomi threw her arms around his neck, overwhelmed with gratitude not just for the funding, but for having a partner who understood that her dreams were their dreams, that making her school better made their community stronger. You know what this means, she said, pulling back to look at his face. What? Sophia and Jaden and all the other kids who are struggling with reading, they're going to have the support they need. They're going to discover that books can take them anywhere, that education really can change their lives. Harrison kissed her forehead, marveling at the way her excitement about helping others made her even more beautiful. Just like it changed yours. Just like it changed both of ours, Naomi corrected. As the sun set over Brooklyn and the city settled into evening, they sat together on their front steps, planning lessons and foundation initiatives and all the ways they could use their combined resources, his money and her heart, his connections and her classroom, to make their corner of the world a little bit better. What's one small way you could make your community better tomorrow? We'd love to hear your ideas in the comments. And if occasionally Naomi caught Harrison looking at her with the same wonder he'd shown that first day in Savoy's restaurant, if he sometimes seemed amazed that this life, their life, was really real, she understood completely. After all, the best love stories weren't about perfect people finding each other. They were about broken people healing together, about second chances and hard-won wisdom and the radical act of choosing to build something beautiful from the pieces of who you used to be. They were about learning that sometimes, when you stop looking for happiness and start creating it instead, you discover that the love you need has been waiting for you all along. This story reminds us that love isn't about perfection. It's about two people choosing to grow together through their mistakes and victories. What's the most important lesson about love that you've learned in your own life? Share your thoughts below and let's continue this conversation about what makes relationships truly meaningful.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.